Can I just say as well that we are running short of time,
yeah,
so I think if we
we're not
could
getting
just...
the answers, so let's move on.
Do you want to ask any further
no.
questions? Okay, James Daly.
Well, that's what I call a proper strop. Well, hello then, I do hope you're all well. Now, I try not to do these sorts of intros too much, but I just felt that this video needed a little bit of context. Now, this is the Minister for Drugs Policy for the Scottish Government and MSP, Angela Constance. Now, she was at a Home Affairs committee meeting yesterday about use of drugs, so to speak. Well, in this video, Conservative MP Tim Loughton wanted to know why is there sort of like more drug misuse, so to speak, in Scotland than there is in England. Well, the conversation got very interested, and I just wanted to say that in no certain terms were I laughing at this very serious subject, but at the fact that Tim Loughton was gradually having a meltdown. And you have to watch this hilarious incident at the end where Tim Loughton forgot that the mics were still on. Enjoy and take care.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, welcome. Thank you for coming to the committee today. I'm quite interested in your take on why there is such a differential between serious substance misuse in Scotland compared to England, for example.
Yeah. So it is complex, deep-seated. It has been many years, decades in the making. Some of the factors, will of course be familiar, across the UK and in other jurisdictions. We know the relationship between deprivation, poverty and inequality, mental health, adverse childhood experiences. We also know that a drug or alcohol problem can happen to any family in any part of the country. It does cut across, the socio-economic divide, but clearly, the reason, that Scotland has double the prevalence rate. Fair to say that prevalence estimates across the UK are probably out of date, and I'm aware that all countries are working to update how they understand prevalence in their own country. But in terms of the information we currently have, it appears that prevalence of problematic drug use in Scotland is double what it is south of the border, and that will of course speak to socio-economic and some cultural aspects of this as well. We've already spoke about the increased prevalence of opioids and benzodiazepines, and I won't repeat that, convener. Other aspects is that polydrug use is higher in Scotland, so we have more lethal combinations of substances.
Sorry to jump in. Nothing to do with me. What happened with the screen there? I do apologise.
And also it's higher risk drug taken. So if you compare opioid use in Scotland to say the Netherlands, there are far fewer opioid users in the Netherlands would inject. So there's a real combination of factors that...
Can I just ask you, because the question was why, not a description, and you've challenged the figures. So are you saying that the figures that the committee has got,
I'm not
where
not
drug deaths...
Not at all.
Well, you've just said that you thought some of the figures about prevalence were out of date. So do you agree with the figures that the death rate from drugs is 5 times higher in Scotland than it is in England, by far the highest across the whole of Europe? So are the figures correct or not?
So the annual report, absolutely. So actually we have the worst drug death rate in the UK and across Europe. That I have never in 1 minute ever disputed that. I was just trying to say that some of the data around comparing prevalence and implication of substances is a bit more complex. But laying that aside, I do not dispute do not dispute the drug-related death figures
so why
at
is it
all.
so bad?
At all. So because we've got double the prevalence. That's
Why?
the reason. We have an increased implication in deaths of benzodiazepines and a greater opioid problem. We know
Why?
that deprivation is a factor. We know that there is a need to reform services, so that services are more joined up. I would, as a former mental health officer, I would, could talk for a long time about the connectivity between mental health problems and substance use. I've also touched upon how we need all the tools in our box, and that the current legislative framework impedes harm reduction.
Okay, Ms. Constance, you're still not telling me why. You've attacked out-of-date legislation which applies to the whole of the United Kingdom. I think we're agreed on that, and this committee will make recommendations about whether the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 is fit for purpose, is beyond its sell-by date. The fact is that that legislation applies to England and to Scotland. So under the same legislation, the record of serious substance misuse in Scotland is much, much worse. And we're trying to get to the basis of why you think that is. Because it's not just in drugs, is it? The record in alcohol is equally as appalling. 1,330 drug-related deaths in Scotland, 1,245 alcohol-specific deaths in Scotland. Again, way worse than the rest of the United Kingdom. So you've had the same laws, you have devolved health, and everything you've mentioned so far seems to be the solutions are down to health. So why is it's so much worse in Scotland than in England? What are you doing wrong, or what is different about the Scottish population that you've not been able to address against England or the rest of the United Kingdom?
So with respect...
Sorry for butting in, and I'm not laughing at the context of the conversation. I'm just laughing at the fact that you could tell in the background Tim Loughton's ticking. He's not getting the answers he wants, or maybe he was not getting the answers he requires. Who knows? But I just found I could hear him ticking in the background, that's all.
Sir, I think you have misrepresented my position. I have been very upfront and direct around things such as the Misuse of Drugs Act, but I think if I refer you to my earlier comments, I have never for a minute demurred from our responsibility as a devolved administration in and around health services and our justice system. But again, with respect, I have pointed to the nature of the challenge and the significant differences. And I know that people will sometimes want to point score or make political points, and I actually haven't sought to do that. I've sought to be very pragmatic and focus on the evidence. And I would contend that we all have a responsibility, that actually Scotland's situation, doesn't reflect well on any tier of government. Particularly, we, for example, are taking some innovative strides to address child poverty. For example, Scottish Child's Payment, for example, will lift 50,000 children out of poverty.
Hey, Minister, you've just said that...
When she said that, he'll be ticking now. I think his head will be ready to explode.
You're not interested in point scoring. You're now going on to a completely different...
I think I'm giving you an example.
You're now going on to a completely different area.
Using our powers.
You're now going on to a completely different area of policy away from drugs. I've asked you a simple question for your view, for this committee to try to get an understanding of why the situation in Scotland is so appallingly worse than the rest of the United Kingdom and Europe. You've pointed a lot to the law. That is irrelevant because the same law applies. The reason, it strikes me, is that the health approach has not been effective. Now you're trying to say it's deprivation. There are many parts of England where deprivation is as bad or worse than across Scotland, and yet we do not have the prevalence of drug-related deaths, let alone alcohol-related deaths, as you do in Scotland. What is going wrong in Scotland that your record, whether you want to put it down to your government or not, is so bad?
So actually, I've never once in my position as the Minister for Drugs Policy walked away from our responsibilities. And of course, I am accountable to the Scottish Parliament and to the people of Scotland on our record and the actions that we're taking past, present and future. And we have reinvigorated investment and reform of services because they weren't meeting needs. And I think that's a very frank admission of things that have not been done as well as they should have been. But I do think, I think about the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group that often points to how we all end up, with a bit of political posturing as opposed to looking to the evidence. And one of the very important changes that we're trying to implement with our national mission to save and improve lives is to ensure accountability. But accountability, yes, for the Scottish Government, the implementation also of local services, but also the UK Government. We are all part of the problem, but we are all part of the solution. And, laying aside politics as much as, we of course can as politicians, when it comes to saving lives, I think no solution should be off the table. Absolutely no solution should be off the table because our problem is so great in Scotland, and I have outlined, I think fairly extensively, both verbally and in my written submission, about the factors underlying that. I would also point that it's not just the Misuse of Drugs Act and the Equality Act, that we do not as yet have a full range of economic and social welfare powers, but that of course is a matter in the debate for another day. But if I can just end, convene on a point of consensus that perhaps we can all accept that that we all have a role to play, we're all accountable, and we're all part of the solution.
That's apple pie motherhood, Minister.
It's about what works, Mr Loughton. What works.
And what I want to try and understand is why it's not working in Scotland and it's working better, still not well, in the rest of the United Kingdom. But let's move on, because you seem to want to blame everything on
absolutely not.
Devolution.
I think the record will show that.
So why was the post of your title is Drugs Policy created in December 2020, given that there's an equal, if not greater, problem of alcohol-related deaths and alcohol prevalence? Was there is there an equivalent minister for alcohol policy? And as the Minister for Drugs Policy, how do you fit in with health? How does it actually work within the structure of government, and how joined up is your role across various different departments and disciplines?
Yeah, okay. I think, part of our thinking for this dedicated post, if I can be candid, was very much informed by the need for a newer approach, bearing in mind that actually across the UK we have seen record levels of drug deaths across the UK. We are not, UK as a whole, are not leaders in the field. We're not the pioneers of interventions that work, and that across the UK we have much to learn from others. Notwithstanding,
Is she trolling him?
that the challenge in Scotland is undoubtedly greater. So the purpose of my post was drugs policy used to sit within the justice portfolio. It then moved to the health portfolio, and there was a recognition that we needed to have a dedicated, much more cross-cutting approach. So part of our national mission is to ensure that drugs policy isn't seen in isolation, because people are far more than their substance problem. So we need to ensure that drug policy is joined at the hip with mental health, with our work in homelessness. We've got some new legislation coming through in terms of increasing the prevention of homelessness duties. We need to ensure that we are focused on education and prevention as well. I've spoke quite a lot about addressing poverty and inequality, and of course it is important, as well as taking a public health approach to drug policy, that we're also taking that public health approach to justice services too.
Okay, so you've mentioned mental health, homelessness prevention, education and prevention, public health approach. Which of those are not devolved matters?
Well, I can only, as a minister,
It's
operate
a factual question,
and change.
Minister. It's
Well,
a
I only
factual
have.
question.
I'm a minister in a devolved administration, so inevitably, my job is focused on devolved services.
Which of those subjects which you have mentioned, which are part of your job,
I think-
are not the exclusive preserve of your government to tackle without having to apportion blame to the United Kingdom government?
I think I've been very clear that we all have a responsibility here, particularly when it comes to addressing poverty and inequality. So I've never disputed our responsibilities, and actually I've often spoken very frankly, given my own frontline experience, notwithstanding that it's 20 years ago. This just looks like what the Conservative Policy Reform Group was talking about, political posturing. With respect, Mr Loughton, I'm focused on solutions.
What's the Conservative? I'm not sure who this group are. What have they got to do with it? Who this
Can I
group?
just say as well that we are running short of time,
Yeah,
so
well,
I think if we
we're not
could
getting
just...
the answers, so let's move on.
Do you want to ask any further
no.
questions? Okay, James Daly.
Well, that's what I call a proper strop. Do you think he'd calm down once this select committee meeting had finished? No.
But yeah, she knows what she's talking about. Why didn't she answer any bloody question?
Not
You're
after.
so loyal, Stuart.
And
you
I'll
really
just remind everybody that the microphones are still on.
Yes,
as we
Mr.
get
Loughton.
everybody settled.